Okay, so we're ready to talk now about the nervous system. So we're in Chapter 10 with the first of 3 chapters where we look at components of the nervous system. In this chapter, we'll be looking at kind of basic neuron structure, how neurons function, and then sort of the organization of the nervous system. In Chapter 11, we'll be looking specifically at the structures of the central nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord, how that's put together, and then at the peripheral nervous system, so all of the peripheral nerves of the body and how they're put together. And then finally in Chapter 12, we'll be looking at the sensory structures, so the general and special senses, how it is that we get information to the brain and into the spinal cord so that we can make some choices about it. But we're going to start by talking about the functions, doing some basic introductory work. So shall we begin? So there are 2 types of cells that we find in the nervous system. There are neurons and neuroglia. So 2 types of cells. The neurons are the communicating cells. So these are the ones that do communication. And then the neuroglia are the support cells. They attend to the needs of the neurons, and they do the work of protecting them. So this is all support. And when I say support, I mean not just physical support, but they do that. They hold things in place. But they also regulate and maintain the environment around the neurons as well. And so here in the 2 pictures, these are, again, electron micrographs, and they're falsely colored. But in this top one, the neurons are the kind of, if you can follow my little pen, my cursor here as I kind of move around, these are the neurons in yellow. And then the purple stuff all around them are the neuroglia, and some of this green is neuroglial cells as well. And then here in the bottom picture, the neurons, again, are reddish, and you can see that they have these plump central regions and then all of these things, projections sticking off of them. So we'll be describing those. And everything that's kind of bluish colored, those are the neuroglial cells. And you can see where the nuclei are. So these circular things, that's where the nucleus of the neuroglial cells are found. So the nervous system is the master control and communication system of the body. It's responsible for noticing conditions around it, for determining how to respond to that, and then for creating the response, or for communicating to the responding cells. There we are. That's a better way to say it. Communicating to those responding cells what it is that they need to do. And so it's the nervous system that has primary responsibility for maintaining homeostasis in the body. Now there are some self-regulating components of homeostasis. We've talked a lot about that. But a lot of homeostasis is maintained through the control provided by the nervous system. And there are 3 functions, and they kind of overlap each other, that we see associated with the nervous system. The sensory function, noticing. The integrative function, that's the deciding what to do in response to what we've noticed. And then the motor function, which is when work needs to be done. The motor function tells the body, tells the parts of the body that can respond to the nervous system what to do. So let's take a look at those 3 functions. The sensory function is all about monitoring stimuli. And when I use that term stimulus or stimuli, those are the changes that we see in the internal and external environment. So that's the stimulus, and stimuli is the plural of that. And it monitors using specialized cells that are referred to as sensory receptors. And these are cells that respond to the changes that they notice around them. And that's what we'll be looking at when we go to Chapter 12, is those sensory receptors. And so we can talk about that, the information coming in as the nervous system monitors stimulus as sensory input. The integrative the functions, those are where we take that sensory input and process it. We can use it to create sensations. So maybe you're noticing that the bathwater is a little too cool. And so that feeling cool is a sensation. So it creates those sensations that the body notices. It can store and retrieve information, so it can make memories and then compare the information that's coming in to those memories, and then determine what is the best response to the changes that are being noticed in either the internal or the external environment. And then finally, once that response has been determined, the motor function is all about communicating out there to the effector tissues. And so we talk about effectors. Those are the tissues or the cells that respond, that produce the effect associated with the decision that's been made. And there are only two effector tissues in the body. Muscles, so muscle cells can respond, and all three types of muscle cells will respond to the motor commands being sent out by the nervous system. So cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle can all respond to the commands that are sent out. And then the other effector tissue is a gland or gland cells. So gland cells can respond to, and that, to me this is amazing, because when you really narrow down and focus in on what it is that the brain and the spinal cord can control, all they can control is the contraction of a muscle or the secretion of a gland. But in response to those two very simple commands, we see an amazing diversity of ability with the body. We move, we talk, we think, there's just so much that could be done, all because we can talk to and tell a muscle or a gland cell what to do. And so all of those commands that are sent out by the brain, that are being sent out, thousands of commands every second, that's motor output. And so we use that word motor to describe the working that happens in response to the stimulus in response to the messages that are being sent out by the nervous system. So we sense, we determine what to do based on what we're sensing, and then we go and do it, the motor function. Okay, so maybe to bring this into like a little bit sharper clarity, let's think about your drive to some place that you were driving to recently. So you're driving along and you see a red light ahead of you. Seeing that red light, that's sensory input coming in. Your nervous system integrates this information. Okay, back when I was learning what to do, when I saw red lights, back in the driver's ed class that I took, I learned that a red light means I need to stop. So you recognize, I've got to stop this vehicle now. So there's the integrative function. And then finally, how do we stop the vehicle? Well, we have to tell the muscles of the leg to move the foot over and stomp on the brake pedal, and there's our motor output. That command to move the foot and to gently depress the brake pedal so that you come to a nice, even, smooth stop. There you are. That is what the nervous system can do. Okay, so let's look now at the organization of the nervous system. And there is, I think it's in the second page of your notes, I've got a little flow chart that can help you make some sense of this too. But when we think about the nervous system, we can divide the nervous system into two different major anatomical groupings. There's the central nervous system, composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything that's not part of the brain or the spinal cord. So let's start here at the bottom of the page, and I reversed them here so that I could get that graphic in there. And notice we've got central nervous system on this side, the peripheral nervous system on this side. So when we look at the central nervous system, the parts of the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and there are lots more parts to the brain. We'll learn that in the next chapter. All of the spinal cord making its way down through the cervical vertebra into the, passing through the thoracic vertebrae. Ooh, look at that. That graphic's misspelled thoracic. And then down into the lumbar vertebrae and into the sacrum, where the spinal cord kind of splays out into this horsetail looking thing. So that's the central nervous system, and it's enclosed and protected by the bones of the skull and the vertebral column. We've learned about those looking at the skeletal system. And this is where we find that integrative center of the nervous system. It receives the sensory input, it interprets it, makes sensations from it, it compares it to old memories, and determines whatever the appropriate response is based on those past experiences or based on reflex actions. We'll look at reflexes when we get into chapter, reflexes are in the next chapter, in chapter 11. So it determines that appropriate response. So it receives sensory input, determines the response, and then puts together how that response is going to be carried out. So it makes the plan for it and then sends out the command, that motor function command. And it's also the seat of what we talk about of the higher functions of the brain. Things like intelligence and memory and learning, and even though emotions may seem more like a basic function of the body, but those emotions, we can put that into higher functions as well. So the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, it's our integrative center. And it comes up with, by evaluating the sensory input, it comes up with the appropriate motor output so that the body can go out and do what it's supposed to do in order to maintain homeostasis and get what it needs. So that's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything that's located outside the central nervous system. And so it's the communication between the central nervous system, where the plan is made, and the effector tissues of the body. And it's composed primarily of nerves. Nerves we're going to look at more as we make our way through this chapter, but just for talking about what a nerve is right now, nerves are not individual neurons. So I had that confused when I first started teaching this class. And I thought of a nerve and a neuron as the same thing. And I've gotten pretty good now about getting my speech right. But I could still get that confused. So just bear with me and I'll try to correct myself very quickly. So nerves, though, are bundles of what are referred to as nerve fibers. They are the long extensions of the neurons that are all wrapped together in a connective tissue package. And so that's a nerve. It's not individual neurons, but it's parts of many neurons, all kind of wrapped together into a package of connective tissue. And there are, we look at the nerves and we count them and we name them based on whether they arise directly from the brain itself, and those are the cranial nerves, and there's 12 of them. So these are the Roman numerals 1 through XII, that means 12. X is 10, and the two I's make 11 and 12. So the cranial nerves, 1 through 12, carry signals to and from the brain. The spinal nerves, there are 31 of them, one pair associated with each of the vertebrae of the body. They carry the signals to and from the spinal cord. And then once we're in the spinal cord, then we're talking about central nervous system again. So spinal nerves, 31 of them, cranial nerves, 1 through 12. And when we get to the next chapter, chapter 11, I'm going to ask that you learn the names of the cranial nerves. We won't do the same thing with the spinal nerves. So that's the good news. Bad news is you have to learn 12 neuron or nerve names, and they're all associated with the cranial nerves. Okay, so we're done talking about the central nervous system for this video. And so what we're going to do now is further divide the peripheral nervous system into two different categories or groupings. So all that peripheral nervous system stuff, we're going to divide it into the sensory division and the motor division. And we talk about the sensory nerve division as being afferent, or some people say afferent. You can say it however you wish. I like to say it afferent just so that you can distinguish it when I speak from efferent. So afferent and efferent are two terms that relate to each of these, or to the two divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Afferent means that it brings information toward the center, toward the most important part, or the reference point. Afferent means toward, so these are nerve fibers that transmit impulses toward the central nervous system from the sensory receptors. So this is how we get sensory input from wherever the sensory receptor is to the central nervous system. Then, and so for instance, if you hold your hand over a candle and you're feeling the heat, then that is information that's being carried along afferent nerves that are bringing information toward the central nervous system. As well, centers in the medulla oblongata are busy noticing pH in your blood. That's one way we know whether we need to speed up respiration or not, is because if pH goes down, then it's time to speed up the respiration. So that's all done with this respiratory center in the medulla oblongata, which is found at the base of the brain toward the posterior of your neck area, or right up where the neck and the head come together. So that is all sensory information being brought directly to the central nervous system. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system, these are the nerve fibers that carry the impulses from the central nervous system out to the effector tissues. Notice efferent and effector. So efferent takes information away from the central nervous system toward the effector tissues. And remember, those effector tissues are muscles and glands. So for example, as you turn pages in a book, you're responding to efferent impulses coming from the brain to telling you to turn those pages. Or as your body releases sweat because you've become too warm, that's, again, efferent transmission from the central nervous system. Okay, so now we're done with the sensory division, that afferent division. But if we look at this motor commands, the information that we send out telling muscles and glands to do their work, there are two subdivisions there. There's the somatic nervous system. Soma means body. So the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So these are two different clusters of neurons or nerves that are controlling two different parts of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so we're still in peripheral nervous system. Now we're looking just at the efferent communication, somatic and autonomic. So let's take a look at those two. Somatic nervous system is also talked about as the voluntary nervous system or the somatic motor division. So two other ways that we can describe somatic nervous system. If it's voluntary, that means, well, remember when we talked about voluntary muscle, what kind of muscle were we talking about? Skeletal muscle. So when we send information via the somatic nervous system, that is efferent transmission that is telling the skeletal muscle of the body that it's time to contract. So, for example, when you lift your arm to bring a glass of water to your lips, that is an example of the somatic nervous system sending out motor commands, the voluntary commands of the body. So autonomic, then, is all of the involuntary components of the nervous system. And so I will use this abbreviation ANS to mean autonomic nervous system. And I'll use that a fair bit toward the end of this chapter, and especially that's the place where I'll use it the most. It's also talked about as the visceral motor division. So we have the somatic motor division and the visceral motor division. And so think about your viscera. When I use that term viscera, that means the guts. That's another term for the guts of the body. So we're talking about the stomach, the stomach, the large and small intestines, the liver, the pancreas. All of those are the visceral organs, the viscera. So that control is all involuntary control. Remember, that's mostly smooth muscle. If we add the heart to it, then we're talking about cardiac muscle as well. And so smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, that's all going to be involuntary controlled muscle. And then, of course, the glands are involved here as well. So these are the autonomic division of the nervous system. These are the motor fibers that transport or transmit impulses to either smooth or cardiac muscle and to the glands. And some examples of this is like, let's say you're out exercising, going for a brisk walk. What happens to the heart rate? Well, it increases. And that is because of autonomic motor commands. The adrenal glands, like if somebody sneaks up behind you and scares the bejesus out of you, the adrenal glands will give a big old shot of epinephrine to your blood. That, again, is autonomic control being exerted. It's not something, you can't make your adrenal glands by thinking your adrenal glands. You can't make them secrete epinephrine. But unconsciously, involuntarily, you will secrete epinephrine if you've been frightened. Okay, so we're done now with the somatic nervous system, the voluntary control. Let's take the autonomic nervous system and further subdivide it into two different groups, two functional divisions. And we talk about them as the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. These are the two divisions, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. These two functional divisions of the ANS work in opposition to each other. So where sympathetic causes one effect, parasympathetic stimulation will cause the opposite effect. So in general, if we had to come up with some functions that relate to sympathetic division, we're talking about fight or flight type functions of the body. We're generally preparing the body for action of some sort. So in response to sympathetic stimulation, you'll see an increase in the heart rate and in the force of the contractions of the heart, an increase in respiration, dilation of the bronchi of the lungs, pupil dilation, bringing in lots more information through the eyes. And why would we dilate the lungs? Well, by making the tubes inside the lungs larger, we're going to get more oxygen into the body. And then it inhibits some of the sort of, the housekeeping functions that wouldn't matter. If you're being chased by a leopard and about to be eaten, you don't need to worry about digesting food or about peeing or whatever might need to happen because you're in a life and death situation. And so this sympathetic control is all about prepping you for fighting or flying, fleeing. Those are the two things that sympathetic control does. Parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, it does the opposite of the sympathetic division. And sometimes it's referred to as the rest and digest system. So if we were to look for generalities, we would see that parasympathetic control and stimulation will calm the body and stimulate the digestive and excretory functions of the body. So that's why we talk about it as rest and digest. So for example, with parasympathetic stimulation, the heart will slow its rate and will decrease the force with which it's beating. It'll slow the respiration, so you'll breathe more slowly. It'll constrict the bronchi and contract the pupil, just because you don't need to gather as much information through your eyes, and you don't need as much oxygen. And it will bring on the urge to urinate, or bring back into action the secretion and movements of the digestive tract. So sympathetic gets you prepared for action. Parasympathetic gets you calmed down. So when I think about these two, the first thing when I first started teaching this, I thought to myself, oh gosh, now when do I see these two things coming into effect, playing out in my body? And I remembered when I was a kid and playing hide and seek. And so if you can imagine for a second now that you are a young person, you're playing hide and seek, somebody is counting. And so they got their eyes covered and you are a hider. And you've got to run as fast as you can, looking here, looking there, trying to find a place to hide. So you finally find your place to hide, you're breathing quickly, you've just done your flight stuff. There's the sympathetic division coming into play. And so you make it to your hiding place and you begin to relax into your hiding place. And you're calming down, and then what happens? If you're like me, what happens was you suddenly were overwhelmed by the urge to pee. Oh my gosh, I would get into my hiding place, and then there I'd be like, oh, good, perfect hiding place, I'm all good. And then every part of my body is just screaming, it's time to get up and go somewhere to pee. And that's because parasympathetic control was coming back on and was calming my body down and then telling me, hey, we need to take care of some of these important functions. So again, they work in opposition to each other, doing opposite things. So here we are. We've been introduced now to the general functions of the nervous system and a little bit about the functions that are there, that the role of collecting sensory information, determining what to do based on the sensory information that comes in, and then sending out commands to do that work. And then we talked about the organization of the nervous system, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Within the peripheral nervous system, the sensory division and the motor division. And within the motor division, then the somatic nervous system, where we control the voluntary movements of the body, all that voluntary skeletal muscle. And then the autonomic nervous system, where we control the involuntary functions of the body. And then within the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. With sympathetic getting you ready to either stand your ground or to run, and the parasympathetic division helping you to relax, to calm down, and to stimulate all of the digestive and excretory functions of the body. And so there in your notes, I gave you a list of some of the opposite effects or the opposing effects that we see associated with the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So take a look through those different functions and be ready to understand that. We're going to come back at the very end of this chapter to look at those two divisions and make a little bit more sense out of them. So we'll come back to this as well. And be sure to look through the little graphic I have that's it's labeled human nervous system in your notes. And what I'm trying to show there is this organization that we've just described. All right, so I'll see you in the next lecture.